So we've got question time on the brain and society, and we've got some outstanding speakers here, really world-class panel assembled. They're each going to speak pretty briefly, maybe leaving you wanting more, but then after they've all spoken for 5 or 6 minutes, we'll open this up to questions. So without more ado, let me begin by asking Professor Clive Gamble from our archaeology department to speak first. Clive.
Thanks very much, Alex, and welcome everyone. And here's my first slide. I'm going to talk to you about brains as they develop. Next, please. And this is the heart of the problem, or the heart of the issue. Here. And the chimpanzee brain is about 1/3 our size. So we last had an ancestor with the chimpanzees about 7 million years ago. And in that time, this is the way that human evolution has gone, into this incredible expansion of the brain. Next, please. And if we look at that within our own fossil record, we can go back to 4 million years ago, and here's this wonderful little ancestor called Ardipithecus, a little lady from Ethiopia. 4 million years ago, she has feet like hands, so she can still go up trees. She's bipedal walking, but she has a tiny little brain, less than 400 cubic centimeters. Everyone in this room today has a brain of above 1,200 cubic centimeters. So we're up here on this part of the graph. And a good example of a fossil ancestor who has such a large brain is our old friend Neanderthal, and I'll come back to him in my last minute. Next, please. So what you have to ask is, what can you do with such a big brain, a brain that's 3 times the size of a chimpanzee and getting bigger during our evolutionary history? Well, some of the things that happen are things like language, the control of something important like fire, technology, and art, which if you go to the British Museum at the moment, you'll see fantastic examples of art from the last 40,000 years. But there's one thing that's missing here, which I want to just throw out to you, and hopefully you'll be able to come back at me with some questions on this. Next, please. I want to talk about the social emotions. The reason I believe we have such large brains is to be able to deal with each other, to be able to monitor who we are, and to also bring into the whole way that we interact with each other the idea of a social emotion. Now, what do I mean by that? Next, please. Well, we all know what primary emotions are, things like fear, disgust, anger, happiness, and sadness. And as you can see here with this gorilla mum who's grieving for her dead child, we share all those emotions with other species. And the reason we do that is because it's good survival value. It's very good to feel fear when the hyenas are about to attack you, as they would have done on the savannas of Africa many millions of years ago. Next slide, please. But what we don't have, or what we have rather, and which these other animals don't have, are these social emotions, the ability to feel shame and guilt. No other animal has that. Certainly chimpanzees don't, and certainly your family pets don't have shame and guilt. And the reason is because to have those very basic human emotions which guide much of what we do, you have to recognize another person's point of view. You have to have, in the jargon, what's known as a theory of mind. You have to be able to understand that my view of the world is not the same as your view of the world. And this comes during human evolution. It comes during human development in children between the ages of 3 and 5. If you've got brothers and sisters, you'll probably have seen them make that transition. With humans, it comes really, though, rather early. Next, please. Next, please. Next slide. We seem to have got them stuck. But anyway, the point is, here we go. the point is that this occurs when we start to get large brains, and it starts to give us a very different idea of our ancestors. This is the traditional view of our ancestors, a kind of hairy caveman waiting behind a cliff somewhere, waiting to mug something with a big club. Next. Instead, I think what we have are the very first ideas about moral ancestors who don't just belong to our species, Homo sapiens, but who include Neanderthals, and in fact many of these large-brained ancestors that can take us back to about 500,000 years ago, so that we have an idea of ourselves and our idea of the way that we conduct the world in a kind of moral sense of understanding good and bad behavior goes back much, much further than we ever imagined before. And that's one of the things that comes out of understanding why we have such large brains and what we use them for. Thank you.
And our next speaker is Professor Tom Lynch, from psychology.
Am I on? Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to talk about signaling matters. It's interesting what Clive said because there's a lot of parallels I think you'll find. Next slide, please. Okay, so what's fascinating in science, it's rare that you have consensus, but there's some exciting things. We can say now there is actual consensus among people that study things like the developmental trajectories of people's mental health or mental well-being. And it turns out that developmental psychologists, geneticists, all these people, 40-year-long studies are coming to this conclusion that you can actually predict at about age 4 or 5 two types of individuals that if they continue to perhaps either not get help or have some negative things occur, will end up into two broad kinds of problems which map onto other issues. Now, one of the kinds of things that you can see with young kids is this kind of under-controlled child who is impulsive, dramatic, erratic, they're emotionally dysregulated, they're very mood dependent, and they will develop into individuals that have problems with what's called externalizing disorders. Things like borderline personality disorder or substance dependence, conduct disorders common in them when they're young. And then, but what's interesting is what was less, so people kind of know about this, people know about kids that's standing out a lot. There's another group of children that you can identify about the same age that are shy, timid, risk-averse, and these children grow up into adults that are more likely to be experience internalizing disorders and be socially isolated. Next slide. So if you're under controlled, it's very eye-catching, and in fact, most research money goes towards studying people that do really dramatic things. I like this fellow right in the middle here. Next slide, please. But perhaps there's such a thing as too much of a good thing. And so one of the things I want to introduce today is this interesting concept that, you know, here we have the psychiatrist is laying on the couch and the patient sitting in the chair saying, everyone accuses me of being a control freak. Next slide, please. So there's this thing about self-control tendencies. Most models have assumed that if you have self-control, you're able to inhibit your impulses and regulate your emotions. That's a great thing. And in fact, more the better. And so that, if you could press the button. So what most people are thinking about psychological well-being, most models have been based on this idea. It's a linear model that the problem people are those that are out of control. And the more self-control you have, the better. But what we're arguing is maybe there is a little bit of a problem with that. If you could press the next button. What we're suggesting is actually this is a way to understand complex disorders, is that there's problems on both ends. So if you have under control, but also it's a quadratic relationship where also if you're on the other end with over control. And this is a way to begin to start to make sense of difficult to treat disorders, because you'll find on this end we have problems with extreme criminality, borderline personality disorder, but also on this end you have things like refractory depression, anorexia nervosa. All these disorders are not able to be treated. And they're also, one of the things that we're thinking about with this is we're forgetting some important things about the tribal nature of our species. And if you think about let's just take a problem that's really common in society that we struggle with a great deal with, which is suicide. Suicide is a disorder of social isolation. The people that kill themselves are people that feel isolated from community, and the people that are killing themselves the most are on this end and on this end. And so they're doing something to set up conditions where they're not part of community. For example, if you go to a coal mining community, who's killing themselves? The people that are not coal miners. Next slide. So we know then that there's several things we know. There's temperamental influences, genetic influences that make us who we are. There's also family environmental influences. So if you're a dramatic, erratic, kind of under-controlled person, you've been reinforced to escalate to get, so if you get really loud, you're going to get more attention. You might get an extra session with your therapist. You're going to get someone to listen to you. Next slide. But if you're over-controlled, you learn something else. Your environment reinforces you that if I control myself, then good things may happen. Next slide. So what's also fascinating when you think about complex disorders, which I'm talking about, there's influences I mentioned of sociobiographic, family, environmental. We're thinking about self-control tendencies, how you regulate your emotions and impulses. But we also need to take into account temperament. Temperament is genetics about emotions. And there's some really exciting things going on in science right now. We know there's 5 stimuli that your brain responds to that are emotionally based. One of them is safety. The other is novelty, threat, reward, and overwhelming stimuli. But I want to talk about social safety right now. So social safety system is innervated by the parasympathetic nervous system. It's a ventral vagal complex. We used to think there was only one vagal nerve. There's actually polyvagal now. And so if you have when you're feeling safe, you feel content and calm. And you also want to socially affiliate. If you could press the button. So you relax, you want to affiliate, you explore. Next button, please. So it innervates the muscles linked with social engagement. It's fascinating. This area of your brain, which we've now just more or less come aware of recently, innervates your facial muscles. It innervates the muscles of your inner ear. So when it allows you to tune out the lower frequencies in the ambient environment and tune in the higher frequencies associated with the vocalizations of your species. It innervates your larynx and pharynx so that you can have a musical tone of voice. When you're content and calm, you actually have a musical tone of voice. And you can express your emotions on your face very easily. But if you get defensively aroused, this system turns off, you get a numb face, you lose your musical tone of voice, and anyone that's a singer knows this. So this is kind of interesting. There's something about our brains that have evolutionarily evolved to allow us to communicate. And why? Because we had to figure out ways to signal cooperation to other members of our species that did not share our genetic material. Press next. So we got these things to influence gazing, next button, listening, your tone of voice, and facial expressivity. Next slide, please. So what I'm saying is we're tribal and we've forgotten this. If you think about most of the science that's been done in the, going on for quite some time now, in terms of emotions, we've had a bias. We've talked about, because we've gotten really good at looking inside the body. We can do brain scans. We can talk about neurotransmitters. We can talk about cognition. We can talk about physiological arousal. But they've forgotten that emotions evolved to communicate. Darwin wrote about this in 1872 with a seminal book on the communicative value that emotions evolved to communicate to other members of our species. And it turns out, so our species survival is dependent on our signaling cooperation to others. This is how we form groups, because we are not very strong. We don't have a lot of spikes on us or a lot of kind of fur to keep people away. I often call us just a great big sausage. It's like easy to, it's a lot of fun to eat, And what's really amazing is open expression of emotion. There's really robust data here. People that express their emotions openly are actually people desire to affiliate with them more. They're considered trustworthy and genuine. People that blush, for example, are liked more. They're considered to be trustworthy because they actually care about social norms. And so if you inhibit expression, it kind of causes problems. So it turns out we become anxiously aroused when interacting with a non-expressive person. So think about that over and under-controlled. The under-controlled is highly expressive. The over-controlled is the other way. So here's an example. I can show the video clip real quick of why this is important. And think about, this clip will show you someone that is inhibiting their emotions and the impact on another person. So hopefully this will work.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In this still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
I'm my girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, come on, why aren't we doing this? Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing?
Now watch the baby join with the mother.
Yes.
I'm
Oh,
back.
good girl.
Back to the tribe.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good
You can cut.
is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do.
Okay, so you can see that this is what you're seeing here is how you respond in a context that calls for emotional expression. You're out to have a beer or something with someone, and they're not signaling to you a normal expressivity. Your brain reads it as a danger signal, and you get physiologically aroused, and you don't want to hang around with those people. So think about our over-controlled individuals, what's happening for them. Inadvertently, their desire to control, master inner feelings, and be perfectionistic type individuals, set up conditions to actually make them more socially ostracized, leading to greater suicidality and all kinds of problems like that. Next slide, please. So signaling matters. With our patients that we treat that are over-controlled, if you show an expression of concern, which is taught to therapists to do, it actually, for them, is often interpreted as criticism, where for someone that's under-controlled, that very same expression communicates caring and that you want to understand them. So it kind of matters with these kinds of issues. These are the issues that we're teaching our therapists. Last thing I'll just show is about this signaling is there's a really interesting thing that you can start to practice yourself. There's a universal signal of cooperation and affiliation. It's called the eyebrow wag. So when you see someone and they give you an eyebrow wag, what they're actually, when they greet you or whatever, and they say, "Hi, how you doing?" What they're doing is signaling to you that they like you. It's a natural cooperative signal that across cultures throughout our species. So I'll just show you this last clip. Got the sound?
It's not to say that I don't put them down from time to time, but most of the time.
So he's talking about putting his eyebrows. He started off by saying you missed the beginning. Most of the time he's going to talk about putting his eyebrows up. So he's talking about putting his eyebrows up.
Probably shouldn't have mentioned it at the start, because what happens is people just end up looking at your eyebrows and you don't really listen to what you're saying. Just watching these two little bits of fur move up and down. But it is important
The timing's off for the audio.
to know where your eyebrows are when you're talking. Always have your eyebrows up when you're asking someone where the toilets are. Do you know where the toilets are? Toilets? Don't be going, do you know where the toilets are? Toilets. Or, is that your daughter? Is it? Is that your daughter? Do you know where the toilets are?
All right, thanks.
Yes, thank you very much. So I'm going to bring it down to, from a societal view to really a cell biologist point of view. And what we look at in our lab is memory and how we forget memory and what the consequences for that are. Next slide, please. So we know that memory has played such an important role in our lives, and we use it every day in ways that we're not even conscious of. But one of my favorite stories about the importance of memory is that of Christian the Lion, and some of you might know this story. Basically, in 1969, these two gentlemen, John Randall and Ace Burke, went to Harrods, and they saw this little lion cub in a cage. And obviously they felt very bad for him, so they decided, we're going to adopt him, we're going to take him home with us. And they raised him essentially as a dog or a cat, as their pet, and he really became part of their family. But they realized quite quickly that raising a lion in London is probably not the best environment, so they decided to reintroduce him to Africa. And so they went back a year later, and they wanted to see how he was doing. And the conservationists said, well, you know, we don't know how he's going to react to you, because he has reintegrated into the wild. He's actually the head of his pride. So we have no idea if he's even going to remember you, and if he does, he might be aggressive, because now he's not been around humans. Could you slow the next? So they had a documentary film crew with them when they met up with Christian, and this is what happened. Hopefully. So I love that video, not only because, you know, my cat's never greeted me with anything but indifference, but because it just shows you how strong this bond that we have with ourselves, with our pets, that is forged on memory. It's Christian's remembrance of these two gentlemen that is still there, and it's still very powerful and very strong. So, next slide, please. So obviously one of the diseases that's most closely associated, or the strongest associated with memory loss, is Alzheimer's disease, and which is classified really under the heading of dementia. And right now in the UK, there's more than 800,000 people who have this disease alone. I'm sure some of you here may know someone with Alzheimer's disease. And we talk about it obviously from the financial point of view, because we spend billions of pounds a year to take care of this. But anyone who has has a relative or has had to deal with someone with Alzheimer's knows that it's an emotional impact. Walking into a room and having your mother not recognize you is extremely harrowing. So what we try to do in our lab, please, next slide please, is to understand how dementia comes to be. So what is the cellular processes that underlie dementia? And if you look at someone with Alzheimer's disease, you see very clearly, this is someone who doesn't have the disease, that their brains don't look normal. You have these huge bumps and bumps and grooves where it should be a little bit smooth. And that's because you have cell loss. So the neurons in your brain are dying. And that's why these patients have this memory loss. Next slide, please. And if you look under the microscope, if you cut the brain like a loaf of bread, and then you look under the microscope, you see these two characteristic patterns. One is this plaque. So that's just like the plaque on your teeth or the plaque in your heart. And it's made up of this very sticky protein called beta amyloid. And this protein deposits not only in your brain itself, which is this sort of brownish area, but also in the walls of your blood vessels. So why is this bad for our blood vessels in particular? Well, because, next slide please, your blood vessels, this is just a cross-section or a diagram of an artery, your blood vessels have lots of different cells in them. But in particular, they have, in this layer right here, so this is where your blood goes through, is your smooth muscle cells, and this is actual muscle. So obviously, the way that we get oxygen and nutrients to our brain is through the blood, and our brain has a huge metabolic demand. It uses up a lot of oxygen and a lot of sugar, and it needs to do that because we have to keep our brain cells healthy. So how does your body move the blood around from your heart to your brain? It does it by contracting and relaxing your blood vessels, and that happens because these smooth muscles contract and relax. Next slide, please. So if we look at the brain of an Alzheimer's patient, this is the brain, and we stain it for different components, these different proteins. In red here, this is our sticky A-beta amyloid. And what you notice is that when you have red, you very rarely have green. And green are our smooth muscle cells. So what does that tell you? That tells you that this beta amyloid is killing our smooth muscle cells. So what is the consequence of that? Well, You can't contract and dilate anymore. Instead, your vessels can just go like that. So what happens? You don't get blood movement and you don't get enough oxygen and nutrients to your brain. So that then causes, we all know, if these blood vessels break, then that causes a stroke. And this also underlies some of the reasons why we see dementia in Alzheimer's disease. Next slide, please. So what we try to do, and we think that if we start to look at the risk factors for Alzheimer's disease, and that's primarily age, in some cases genetic, although for most of us it's whether or not we have this apolipoprotein E4 isoform. And that this apolipoprotein is important also because it carries cholesterol around our body. And if we have high cholesterol or we have diabetes, we're also at higher risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. So we're starting to understand now and appreciate that in Alzheimer's disease, we have a lot of the same risk factors as you have in cardiovascular disease, right? So hypertension and high cholesterol and diabetes. So obviously, the blood vessels in our body are playing a role in how we develop dementia, or if we age normally, or if we age and then develop dementia. Next slide, please. So what we do in our lab is just really to try and investigate this to see if we can keep our blood vessels healthy, then hopefully everyone will be able to have, this sort of Christian experience where they are able to remember the memories that they formed years ago and are able to access those memories and form new ones. Thank you very much.
And our fourth speaker is Professor Paul Roderick, also from the School of Medicine.
Thank you, and welcome. Thanks. Thanks for inviting me. So I'm a medic with a public health interest now, so public health often spoils the party. So my theme is around addictive behaviours, and particularly around alcohol. It seems through history, man has the propensity to take on certain behaviours, exposures that he enjoys doing, both for his own individual pleasure and part of the tribalization, the socialization, takes on the behaviors like drug taking, like alcohol, like new forms like internet or junk food. And the problem with these behaviors is they become addictive and we become dependent on them. So they're rather like fire, good servants for very bad masters. Very few of them have any direct health benefits. I'll touch a little bit on alcohol. And this now has become a global public health problem, these addictive behaviors. There's a large or massive global industry behind these behaviors to supply our needs and demands, like the tobacco industry, like the food industry, like the alcohol industry. So it's a huge issue for public health and what we do about this. Why is it such a big public health problem? There's been a fantastic exercise called The Global Burden of Disease, which has been widely published in The Lancet, very easily available on the internet. It's looked at the burden of disease globally and looked at the driving factors that lead to early death or lead to disabling conditions that last through the life course and mean we have years where we're not functioning at 100%. And if you touch on all those and look at the things that really drive that, they are the consequences of our addictive behaviours, because globally, tobacco is number 2 and alcohol is number 3. Those are 2 addictive behaviours. If you look in the UK, tobacco is number 1 and alcohol is number 5 and rising. So both globally and in the UK, we have a problem. I'm going to focus a little bit on alcohol, partly because it's quite topical in terms of debates about minimum pricing and control, and it fits in with some of our research. And I know Hazel is going to follow on some issues around alcohol. This is not a new problem in the UK, alcohol, and concerns about binge drinking, drunkenness on our streets. So those of you familiar with UK art and the paintings of Hogarth and Gin Lane and the consequences of drunkenness on the streets is very well illustrated. We've tried to grapple with control. In the early 20th century, we had temperance movements with the growth of non-alcoholic venues, cafes, and the US went even a stage further with prohibition in certain states, but that clearly had some disastrous consequences in terms of illegal brewing and crime, etc. So it's topical, and it's still with us. Most of you will be familiar with the binge drinking and some of the young people drinking too much and the acute effects on crime and consequences both for the individual in terms of trauma to themselves and to others, violence to others, including domestic violence and sexual health problems. But the chronic effects, i.e. the addictive effect of alcohol, given that you need more and more and more, and it takes hold of you physically and mentally, so that despite realizing it may be having harmful effects, you still need to take it, is having a bigger impact. What does alcohol do to you chronically? Many of you will be familiar with the liver getting damaged by alcohol, but it also drives our vascular system in terms of our blood pressure. High blood pressure is very bad for our vasculature, only dementia and strokes. Alcohol drives some of our big cancers, breast cancer in women, bowel cancer in both sexes, and a few others. Has big effects on our mental health. I mean, it's a sort of tortuous cause and effect in terms of depression and suicide, but chronic alcoholism is associated in a sort of two-way street, and has a few other organ damages. So the chronic effects of alcohol and this addiction is what's driving those global burden of disease calculations, along with some of the acute effects around road traffic accidents, not so much in the UK, but globally. So whose problem is it? Is it a lack of self-control that some people become addictive and get the chronic harms? And we've heard the issues of self-control. Is it an individual responsibility? Or are there wider factors that drive people to carry on drinking even when they know it's not good for them and get dependent? The etiology is very complicated, and things like peer pressure, seeing your parent being a drinker, possibly some gene influences, life events that we use alcohol as a prop for, early bereavements, etc. But upstream in the public health angle is there are suppliers of this product, alcohol, that are promoting it, particularly at a young age. They are making it very readily accessible, almost 24-hour, anywhere you go, and they're making it cheap, i.e. the price. So from the public health perspective, those upstream drivers are really where some of the meat and some of the big debates are about what should be the price of alcohol, who should be able to buy alcohol, where should you be able to buy it, who should be able to buy it, and how should it be promoted and advertised. And clearly the drinks industry would like to make although it has responsibility codes, it's really responsible to its shareholders to make a profit. So the minimum pricing thing has been a debate, and it's an ongoing debate which we perhaps could come back to. We've been doing some research, and I know there's some sixth form students here. We've done some research on the binge side, or we're trying to help young people manage the risks associated with alcohol. We're doing work in two of the sixth form colleges, looking at an internet-based app and training the tutors to help individuals discuss if they have alcohol problems. That's very much on the binge side and the acute side. But we're also trying to work with primary care, our GPs, to try and identify within the community those who, when you give them screening questionnaires and questions around the alcohol consumption, not only in the amount, but whether there are certain features that might associate with dependence and excessive amounts, such as some of those emotions like fear and guilt and concern of others about your consumption. We're trying to identify people in the community who are drinking too much, trying to assess their health, particularly their liver health, feed their liver health back as maybe a motivating factor for them to reduce their alcohol, trying to support them with advice and things like web-based support. So we're active both ends of the sort of alcohol binge and chronic consumption fields. I think I want to end there, and we look forward to hearing Hazel's views on the legal side, as that's one of the tools we have for controlling what is a pleasurable thing we do, alcohol, but like fire. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. So our last speaker now is Professor Hazel Biggs, from medicine to law.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I've just got one slide to show you, hopefully. Okay, so I'm a lawyer, and the law gets its claws into everything. So everything we've heard so far, the law has something to say about. So I'm going to start down here. What about your responsibility if you are mentally incapacitated? So if, as Cheryl told us about Alzheimer's, does that mean if you've got Alzheimer's, when are you able to make your own decisions and when are you able to make good decisions? And what the law tells us is that we need to think about the way people respond to society, but we also sometimes need to protect them. So the law has a whole range of ideas around when people are responsible if they're incapacitated in some way. So can somebody understand the context of a decision that they're making? Can they retain that understanding? Can they weigh it in the balance and make a decision? And can they communicate that decision? And if all of those factors are missing, the law would say, well, this individual needs our protection. We need to find another mechanism for helping that kind of person to make decisions that we might hold them to, or that they might need to be protected against. So in certain circumstances, you may not have an understanding of what the implications of a decision you make are. So the law has a mechanism for dealing with that. Okay, but what about if somebody commits a crime? So what about if I go out tonight and I have a little meeting and I get out of control? So we've heard a bit about people being out of control, people's social interactions. So if somebody winds me up and I decide, okay, I've had enough of you, and I hit them, or I take a knife and I stab them. Now, am I responsible for that? What does the law say about that? Well, you might say, well, of course you're responsible. Well, maybe if I'm mentally incapacitated, I might not be responsible. I may not be able to control my actions in the same way. And the law will take that into account in the way that the criminal justice system will deal with us. So the terminology is a little brutal. So the law might say, well, you're not fit to stand trial, so we will dispose of you in another way. We might send you to an institution. We might decide you're insane. Okay. We might have some issues around that. I'm not going to go into those right now because I'm moving on swiftly to the other side of my slide. What about if I have engaged in that antisocial behaviour because I've been drinking, as Paul was talking about? So I've gone out. So at the moment, my glass is kind of empty and I'm topping it up. That may be my 6th or 7th glass. I may therefore be out of control because of something that I have deliberately and intentionally done. I've engaged with this behaviour that has reduced my inhibitions, that has made me become a bit out of control. What does the law say about that? Well, the law will take an attitude that says, if you've deliberately done that, then you've got no excuse. You will still be responsible for your actions. What about if someone else has given you alcohol and you were unaware of it, and you happen to have a condition that says just a little bit of alcohol affects my inhibitions and makes me become out of control? Is that still my fault? Is that something that's in me that means the law should treat me differently? So that's where we get to our woman in the middle here holding her head. She has, like me probably, a headache, or something wrong with her brain, which is making her behave in a different kind of way. If it's something that's internal to her, some kind of condition that she can't control, then the law might take a different attitude. So the law is quite likely then to say, well, okay, you're not responsible for your conduct if it's something you can't control, something in you that you can't control. It doesn't mean that you will get off scot-free. It will probably send you to an institution and label you as mad, because the law can only decide, are you mad or bad in these contexts. What about, however, if you're not sure whether it's an internal factor or an external factor? So we have a whole series of cases, for example, that look at people who have conditions like diabetes or epilepsy, for example. Now, obviously, this doesn't apply to everybody with those conditions, but in certain circumstances, we've had legal cases where people with those kind of conditions have acted antisocially. Maybe they've killed someone, really serious crime. Are they responsible for those crimes if they have a condition that they can't control? Well, this is where it gets even more tricky. So what the law will say in those circumstances is, well, we can take into account the fact that somebody has that kind of condition, but nevertheless, if they know about that condition, have they done something themselves that might exacerbate it? So therefore, if I know I'm a diabetic and I don't take my insulin, or I load myself up on really sugar-heavy drinks, am I still responsible? Am I responsible because I know that? And if somebody else did that to me, So they told me they were feeding me Diet Coke, but they were actually feeding me Pepsi Max. Am I still responsible? So the law will look at those things, it will unravel those things, and I can't give you any easy answers because that's the way the law is. But maybe it will come out in questions. Thank you.
Okay, so that's our 5 speakers from very different parts of the university, but as you can see, the research really is multidisciplinary. It relates to each other in all kinds of interesting ways. So let me turn it over now to you for questions.
Right. I'm a member of the public who lives in the world outside the university. The more I listened to Professor Lynch, the more horrified I became, and the more, because I know a lot of people out there who have got mental health problems, who are constantly having Professor Lynch's sort of thing pushed on them, which has no bearing on the reality that they live in. You know, that it's the issue of how we work psychologically is multifaceted, and what tends to happen is someone writes a report taking a set of variables which are measurable, and then that report gets out and people are forced into the confines of that report, and everything outside that report is ignored, much to the detriment of mental health patients who are seeking help for the various conditions that they have. Can Professor...
Form of a question.
Attempting to, but I'm just putting the background. So how is the research that you're doing going to be tailored such that the results that you get doesn't shoehorn people in the real world? Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the question. I think it's a good question, and it's an important one because I guess, first of all, one of the things that I think is important is that there's a whole, a great number of people who are suffering greatly who have not been recognized before because their problem does not stand out because they are not so easy to spot. And so one of the things I think the benefit of the work we're doing is we're helping clinicians be able to, with compassion, identify and have a way of understanding people that may tend toward being more obsessive compulsive, a bit perfectionistic in how they might think about things, and have a way to help them really rejoin the tribe. Because for people that are over-controlled, for example, their problem isn't so much about fixing themselves. It's more about learning self-compassion and learning to realize that, I mean, they don't need to learn how to inhibit more. They need to learn how to relax inhibitory control. So I guess, I mean, I think that's what's exciting is that we can get to a place where we can understand that it does matter how you control yourself. And so this helps therapists have a kind of a map and compass to know what to do. So if I have someone that's lacks inhibitory control, that lacks the ability to regulate emotions or control their impulses, I can get a sense, at least if I can get a sense that that might be what they're struggling with, then I can know that I want to focus on teaching them skills, ways of managing, to improve their self-control so they can regulate, so they don't get themselves in trouble. And on the other end, though, if I have someone that's over-controlled too much, I don't want to teach them to inhibit more. I want to teach them to chill out, to begin to appreciate their style for what it is, and to learn how to signal to others cooperation in a way that they can join and others and get connected with others. So, I mean, I guess the way we think about it, it's not so much, we're hoping to help people, and that's what we're dedicated to doing. And I think it's complex when you get to actually translating treatments out into the real world, and that's part of our struggle. And we appreciate your comments, because I think it is very difficult. So that's all I can say about it. I guess I hope I addressed it.
Does anyone else want to? Okay, another question, please.
Hiya, Nikki Matthews from the university. I'm interested in the what Clive was saying about one of the things that we have is this shame and guilt that perhaps other species don't have. Bearing in mind that other species also have the ability to work together and are tribal, like chimpanzees and other primates, for example, what do you think that shame and guilt adds to humanity that other species don't have, bearing in mind that we're all tribal species?
Yeah, that's a great question. How long have we got? No, seriously, there is a big debate as to whether chimpanzees have a theory of mind. But the majority view is that they don't. And very often when I talk about theory of mind in this evolutionary context, someone will put their hand up and say, well, my dog feels guilt when they've pinched the dinner. To which my reply is, yeah, that's fine, but the thing about dogs is that they're domesticated. You've domesticated them for exactly those kind of feelings. Go out to the wild and ask the question of the original dog, the wolf. Does the wolf feel any guilt when it's eating Little Red Riding Hood? And I think the answer is no. So we've kind of domesticated dogs to feel that way, and we've anthropomorphized onto them those sorts of things. So that's the first part of the question. The second part of the question, what does this give us? And I think this comes back to what all of us, I think, have been talking about here, particularly Cheryl and Tom, about memory. And for me, the real reason why our brain has trebled in size in 4 million years is because it's there to track other people. It's to, our social lives have driven the evolution of our brain in terms of its size, and it's that memory capacity, particularly in the frontal parts of the brain, which have been so important. And it's tracking others, and it's actually led us to dealing with larger groups. This is the tribal aspect that Tom's talking about, so that chimpanzees get up to sort of the top level for chimpanzee society is about 80 partners with which they interact. If you carry the graph on from that figure to where we are, we come out with about 150. Now, obviously, we live in huge cities and in huge countries, but think about it. Go to your mobile phones. Look at the number of contacts you have on the mobile phone. Go to Facebook and see how many contacts you actually have, and then start to do a rigorous analysis of them, and you'll find that you come up with these figures time and time again. And so I think that that's where these social emotions come in. It's all about regulating and organizing this tribal behavior, this group behavior, which is amplified and which has been ratcheted up in humans, and it's one of the ways that we can cope in monitoring and working out what others are doing.
Hello, I'm Alan Smith, Geography. I had a question for Professor Biggs and perhaps thoughts of the other panel members on the development of the brain and the bearing on the age of criminal responsibility.
Okay, I'm really not an expert on this field at all. At the moment, the law says you can be criminally responsible from the age of 10, assuming that you are of sound mind at the age of 10. So there are various different ways in which that can be measured. Whether that's an appropriate level morally is a different question entirely, and one that I'm sure lots of us will have different views about. So that's as far as I can take you, I'm afraid.
I think just through debates on whether often when you have sort of more sort of severe criminal cases involving children, whether that age is appropriate in our society. Some people believe that you are old enough to know right from wrong if you are of sound mind, whether that age should be adjusted upwards or perhaps downwards.
Okay, well, obviously you have to take into account social context as well as pure chronological age, and that's a concept that we're all familiar with in different circumstances as well. So, for example, you're old enough to drive a car when you're 17. If you go to Disneyland, you have to pay full price when you're 9 because you're probably tall enough, So this is a kind of movable feast. In terms of what the law says, again, it's fairly standardly fixed at the age of 10 in terms of criminal responsibility. In terms of whether you're capable of making a decision for yourself for medical treatment, that would be a rather different kind of age. And that might depend on that would be assessed according to your ability to understand the decision that you're about to make, which allegedly is what the criminal law of responsibility says also. But I personally would dispute that, and I think other people might want to come in at this point.
Oh, sorry. Well, I'm not. So in this global world, even if we take comparative countries in terms of development, there's quite a variance, isn't there, in the age of different countries, even our sort of fellow Western developed countries. There doesn't seem to be a right answer. And so I guess it's a challenge, really. If we have a global world, why isn't the UN and the human rights agenda saying we need to fix this? It's like a postcode lottery, depending on which country you happen to be in as a child, at what age you would be responsible. Why? Maybe that's the development of the human species over the next few centuries to get some harmonisation of things like this.
No, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, if you think about the fact that we've only so far had one case that's come to fruition through the International Criminal Crimes Court, and that case involved a dictator who forced young children to become war criminals, essentially, and he was held to account for that. We must recognise that children are malleable, and that therefore we ought to be more responsible as a community for what we hold them accountable for and what we do to them in that process.
Would you like to hand your microphone over to
Hi. My question about autism and Asperger's, because I could ask any panel a question. There's quite a big subject, I believe, and it affects 3% of the population. So, because developmentally, you have said in the middle somewhere, we require social relationship. So, where did that go wrong for the Asperger's or autism? And how the evolution didn't allow it to happen? That is in terms of social communication, question one. Question two is why the society is scared of difference, because people with social communication difficulties has been perceived as different, and it also has got control and over control and under control in it.
So maybe Cheryl to
I don't know a lot about Asperger's per se. I guess it relates sort of back to the question that was just asked in terms of maturity. From a cell point of view, your brain doesn't really mature until you're in your 20s. And then we used to think you were born with the number of neurons, so brain cells that you would ever have, and then that's it, and then basically they're going to die over your life course. But now we know it's a little bit more sophisticated than that. But yeah, basically from a biology point of view, your brain is not yet mature until it's in its mid-20s. What happens with autism and Asperger's, I don't know. I think that, I think people think that they're perhaps on a spectrum. So depending on where you fall within that spectrum, you will have, perhaps one or the other. But from a developmental point of view, it's still really up in the air as to why that develops.
Okay, so my thoughts on this are that, first of all, inhibitory control was a really important evolutionary development for our species. And why? It's part of our intelligence, the way I would argue it, is at some point, our species, we lived in an abundant area. We didn't need to travel outside of there was abundant food sources. And at some point, we had to develop a capacity to not eat all the food in one moment. There's the biscuits that are there, and instead of gobbling it all up, we save it for a rainy day. So inhibitory control allowed us to actually plan ahead and delay gratification so that we could be more effective. So I think that when you think about Asperger's and autism spectrum, I think you're absolutely right. We would think about this as genetically predisposed. It's a genetic anchor for over-controlled. And so there's good things about having over-control, again, because you're able to plan ahead, you're able to delay gratification, but there's also kind of a problem too because of this importance of us signaling cooperation. So people with Asperger's or autism actually lose that capacity to signal to others that they like them. You'll see it also in all kinds of other ways. For example, chronic pain conditions, people that have serious pain, because it triggers their defensive arousal system, it turns off their social safety system. So they get a flat face, and so when they interact with people that are taking care of them, caregivers often talk about being burnt out by interacting with people that are very depressed for a long time or have chronic pain conditions. And why is that? It's because the person that they're taking care of can no longer use their facial expression to augment their vocalizations. When they say, thank you, I really appreciate that, it's done with a flat face, and it feels inside the other person that somehow it's not genuine. It's a whole package we need for communication. Like right now, you're nodding, and you're signaling to me something that you're liking me. There's some signaling going on right there, and we do this all the time. So I guess when I think about Asperger's and autism, it's a biological anchor, and we would put next to it anorexia nervosa, restrictive. And next to that would be obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, then paranoid personality disorder, then avoidant personality disorder, and then kind of social phobia, social anxiety. We're getting more into the flexible controlled, which is that middle part where and we think flexibility is a critical component associated with well-being. What's flexibility? Being able to do what's needed in the moment, to be able to change. Sometimes you can be rigid and really, tough about something and then relax and let it go. It's that rigidity that you might see in autism spectrum that's also a problem. So it's a fascinating area, I think.
Make a comment on that as well. You have said quite a few other conditions as well that adds up quite a lot of population, and I think these conditions quite a bit varied on the population, but the population or the society wants everyone the same. So different is a problem. And how the society allow the creativity and a difference. Just a comment.
I just say there's good news is that because the brain is bidirectional, we now know this. So what you do will change how you feel. So some of the things that we're working on right now is you can actually teach people how to change their you can actually change the physiology, activate the social safety system by doing things like an eyebrow wag. Right now, if you all did an eyebrow wag, put a half smile on your face, take a deep breath, you will trigger the parasympathetic nervous system ventral vagal complex, whether you like it or not. Now, it can come off very quick, too. But we can teach people then how to actually improve social signaling in these ways, and that's maybe a promise. It's exciting.
It's interesting how many of you, I don't know, instinctively were doing the eyebrow wave and the half smile. Do we have another question? Yes.
Hi, I'm Tim Cook. I'm an education psychologist in Southampton City and here at the university. Tom, I was interested by what you were saying about under-controlled and over-controlled behaviour and wondering about your thoughts on the life circumstances or the characteristics that might lead towards that, any links towards attachment and things that we can do about that.
Okay, so what do we know? We need to know a lot more, first of all. But what we do know is a couple things. If you're, the data suggests that if you're going to have problems with under control, one of the things that shows in terms of trauma, you're more likely to have severe trauma that's sexual or physical in nature. It happens a little bit older. Where the data suggests, again, remember, there's more work that needs to be done, that individuals that fall on the over-controlled spectrum are more likely to have what's called emotional neglect. Did you notice that still-face experiment where the mother did not give any feedback to that baby? Did you notice how the baby began to eventually turn away? That creates what we see in the over-controlled, which is called an avoidant or dismissive attachment style. It's so aversive to be in a situation where you're interacting with someone that the context is calling for social safety signaling, and the person is signaling to you, not giving you any signal, which basically your brain reads as danger, and it's so aversive. This is what we all feel. and literally the baby has to turn away. So we would expect that to happen. Whereas in your under-controlled, you're more likely to have approach avoidance. They're more likely to have a desire for attachment, and it's kind of an anxious attachment style and that type of thing. So there's a couple thoughts about that. Thank you.
James Eels from chemistry. Is there an evolutionary benefit to the appreciation of art and music, or is that simply a byproduct of large brain size? And as an extension on that, and feel free to not comment if we simply don't know enough in the field yet, but is it possible that when we develop computer consciousness, that the computer, at a certain level of complexity, would then also appreciate art and music?
Just very quickly.
Yes, that's a great question again. The take I have on language, music, art, is that these are ways in which, by and large, we've used both the body and then the things we make, the stuff that survives for archaeologists like me to study, that have actually amplified those. So what we're dealing with here is contexts in which we're interacting amongst each other. And what we're doing, and what we've heard a lot about this morning, is actually building social bonds that bind us ever more closely together as these group sizes, as these tribal groupings get larger. This is the problem that's faced us, is that it could have all fragmented. So we've developed these other mechanisms of which music, dance, performance, singing, all these sorts of things. And we were rewarded for doing it. We've already talked about the brain's reward system actually gives us these chemical highs when we're singing, when we're doing coordinated sports. Rowers get some of the best highs ever because they're doing coordinated activity. And so we are rewarded in this. And of course, there are now these studies which show, and I think this is your last part of your question, which show that as we're typing away or as we're interacting with our smartphones, so the brain is also rewarding us for actually doing that sort of behavior. It becomes pleasurable to us. So yes, so that's how I would see it. These are devices that we've brought in to the fact that we are a very sociable species, and we're already always increasing the ways in which we look to be sociable.